when you're young, you're open to all sorts of bad ideas. And that was probably one of them.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Who Cares Anyway podcast. My guest is Jon Savage, the legendary British author who probably needs no introduction as he is the author of England's Dreaming, the Sex Pistols and Punk Rock, along with several other well-known books, the most recent of which would be The Secret Public, How Music Moved Queer Culture from the Margins to the Mainstream. So that was published in 2024. This interview, on the other hand, was done back in 2019 when I was still working on Who Cares Anyway. And why Jon Savage? A couple of reasons. One is that he is an authority on punk in general, but more specifically, in this case, he was one of the few outside writers, meaning outside of the Bay Area, outside of California, certainly outside of the United States, to have championed bands from the San Francisco punk scene back in that era. Bands like the Sleepers, Avengers, and non-punk bands like the Residents even. He was writing about at a time when not many people were, again, outside of the Bay Area. And then on top of that, he contributed to the San Francisco zine, Search and Destroy, which we'll hear a little bit about, and actually visited San Francisco in 1978, and so we also hear about that trip. He visited San Francisco and LA. The reason that I was able to interview him, I think, I have to credit Michael Belfer for that, Michael Belfer of The Sleepers and Tuxedo Moon, because Jon Savage, being an appreciator and supporter of Michael's work, wrote the foreword for the memoir, When Can I Fly? The Sleepers, Tuxedo Moon, and Beyond, which I worked with Michael on. And so as a result of that and sort of coordinating that, I had the opportunity to ask Mr. Savage if he would grant me an hour of his time, because I wanted to ask him some other questions that would figure into my work on Who Cares Anyway. And in particular, there was a quote, which we'll hear toward the end of the interview, a quote from England's Dreaming that I sort of latched onto, and I wanted to hear him elaborate on that. And so that exchange, in turn, made up a big part of the very last chapter in Who Cares Anyway, when I was trying to sort of make sense of it all. What does it all mean? That sort of thing. And so kind of bookending those two books, the foreword to When Can I Fly and the epilogue to Who Cares Anyway, Jon Savage, a big part in both of those. So I just want to express my appreciation for that. And then one little note of clarification. I made a mention at a couple of points of a book about Harry Crosby, Black Sun, written by Jeffrey Wolfe. And that has come up in a previous interview, episode 2, with Kim Seltzer. But the reason it came up is that Jon Savage, spontaneously mentioned that he was reading that book while traveling from LA to San Francisco. And I had just recently read that book myself on Kim Seltzer's recommendation, and it sort of figured into some of my thinking about, well, some of the people in Who Cares Anyway. And so that is the reference there. But otherwise, I think it's pretty self-explanatory. The audio quality isn't pristine, but it is still better than that of most of the other interviews I did for the book, simply because we were using Skype as opposed to just talking over cell phones. Anyway, I will go ahead and step aside and let us get into the interview with Jon Savage. Just curious, if you could expand on a little bit, like your sense of San Francisco, first of all, compared to England in, say, 1978. In terms of the punk scene
in terms of punk rock.
Yeah.
Well, the main point is that in Britain, punk rock groups had already a sense of privilege, which was they were fairly certain that they would have access to national media straight away. So they would get a review in the music press after a couple of gigs. Then after 10 gigs, they'd get a record contract, and then they'd release a single, and if the single flew, they'd get on top of the pops, which was seen by about a third of the country, da-da-da-da-da-da. In San Francisco, certainly there was absolutely no sense of that. There's a wonderful song by X from LA called The Unheard Music, and it was really true. You know, there were groups like the Sleepers, who are probably my favorite San Franciscan band from that period, that probably had about 3 albums worth of material in them and only released a couple of singles and a belated album in 1981. So there just wasn't the money or the funds or even the expectation that anybody beyond a very small clique would take any notice of them, or that they would get any access to mainstream media. There was no sense of that, because the mainstream rock media was absolutely disgusting. I mean, I grew up in the late 60s, so I was 16 in autumn '69, and I liked all that stuff when it came out. But 8 years later, I did not want to hear Blind Faith or Cream, and I did not want to hear Fleetwood Mac. I did not want to hear Crosby, Stills and Nash. I wanted to hear the fucking Sleepers, and of course, there was no chance of that ever happening. And that's to do with conservatism of American rock music and its culture.
Right. And so would you say that any difference between San Francisco and LA in that sense was just a little matter of degree?
Yeah, very much so, because the LA groups were shut out as well. You know, the LA groups were terrific. I loved the Weirdos and Middle Class and the Zeros. And, they had the same position. You know, what did the Weirdos release in their lifetime? They really, 2 or 3 singles on small labels and an EP. They didn't release an album until a lot later. And the only group that really made it out of all that was X, who were more conservative anyway, as far as I'm concerned, certainly musically. I preferred the Weirdos. I like the Weirdos much more than X, really, and the Avengers, and a lot of those groups. The Avengers were San Francisco, I know, right. And the Dils. And, a lot of the groups on Danger House as well, Black Randy and all that stuff. And it just seemed condemned to be this small self-referential scene, which I thought was a great shame, because I thought these groups were as good as anything, or if not better by that point, than to what was being produced, certainly in terms of punk in the UK. Because punk in the UK had really gone through its cycle by 78, 79, when a lot of these groups were just really getting into their stride.
Right, yeah, and then by that point, even by the time any kind of labels that really existed in San Francisco, that first wave of punk had already kind of petered out. Like, looking back through the fanzines, then you can already see that certain stuff was being pushed, and that certain stuff already looks like a music industry executive's idea of punk, as opposed to what it actually
Romeo
was.
Void.
Right, exactly, yeah. And I don't know if I guess that would be another difference, where they were actually putting out more or less real bands in England, or a real band, a real kind of grassroots band could make it onto a major label.
Yeah, sure. There was a problem in post-punk. There was a lag in '78, and groups like the Banshees and Subway Sect and the Slits, who were the more creative groups that came out of '77, found it difficult to get record contracts. So it wasn't a paradise. Okay. And it was the same in the UK. You got a lot of shitty identikit punk rock groups and power pop groups in particular, which is my big bugbear. I always hated power pop. I liked the Groovies in '72, but it wasn't '72 anymore. I liked, Big Star in '73 or whatever, but it wasn't '72 or '73 anymore. And power pop was just horrible, or became horrible. Even though, in retrospect, there wasn't particularly anything wrong with it. It just was, it was kind of Greg Shaw's wet dream, really. And Greg was a better critic, really, I think, than he was, an A&R man, although he did release some good stuff on Bomb. But he was on the wrong side of the divide, really, which is a shame, I think, beyond a certain point. Also, LA had Danger House, which was a viable label and actually produced quite a lot of records. And so a lot of the Los Angeles groups, and in fact the Avengers got to, I think, put out a record on and so did the Dils. So there was that happening. But, there are other San Franciscan LA groups like the Screamers who never made a record at all, partly because they were too radical and partly because they were too smart for their own good.
Right.
I mean, I interviewed the Screamers in '78, and boy, were they smart ass. They really thought they had it down, and they didn't. But they were still great. But the record companies were not coming to them with their checkbooks open, wanting them to make video discs.
Right. So when you came through, I felt like it was more like February, but then, now I'm looking at
it was late August. It was late August, early September. Okay,
yeah. So,
because I came from London, obviously I was a topic of interest.
Right.
And I stayed with it was my first ever trip to America.
Okay.
And I didn't even go to New York. I went straight to the West Coast, and so I had horrible jet lag. And I stayed in LA first for probably about a week or two, and I met the Screamers, and I hung out with World Imitation Products, who were a band and also made montages. Oh yeah, and I went to the Tlis Club which I wrote about. I went to the club and I saw the Weirdos and the Middle Class and the Dils and Negative Trend, and I just thought it was great. But it just seemed so oppressive with the rent-a-cops and with the real cops outside, harassing people for drinking cokes out on the street. It seemed to, as a Brit, it just seemed to me completely ridiculous. I just thought these groups didn't have a hope, really, which I thought was a great shame. It's always stayed with me, that, because it's a sort of lost moment. My own interest in it ceased pretty quickly as soon as it got into hardcore, because to me hardcore was all about aggressive boys, and I was interested in outcasts and weirdos and gay people and LGBT right the way across, and I wasn't interested in straight young men but behaving like arseholes. I mean, people have had a go at me for that, and it's just like, well, I don't fucking care. I don't like it. And you can't make me.
This is a bit of a different topic, but I was just curious about the book, the Harry Crosby book, the Black Sun.
Oh yeah.
Because what's funny is I actually read that last year based on a recommendation from somebody who mentioned that Tim Mooney from the Sleepers had read it and liked it, and I'm curious. It could be that he found out about it from you, or unless a lot of people were reading that book.
It was a big book. I think you could check the date. I think it was published in '77.
Oh, okay.
And when you're young, you're open to all sorts of bad ideas. And that was probably one of them. I can't remember where I heard about it. I might have heard about it from Throbbing Gristle, but I might have actually discovered it myself.
I think you might have been. I didn't know if you brought it to San Francisco, or you might have been the one who recommended it.
Well, I would have done because I was reading it. I remember distinctly reading it on the plane between Los Angeles and San Francisco, looking out the window and wondering where the hell I was, really. Because don't forget, for a Brit, being on the West Coast is like being in outer space. New York is kind of fine, but really the West Coast is, not your normal planet as far as the European is concerned.
Even from where
I felt. Sorry?
Even growing up in North Carolina, it's almost like at least another country.
Yeah, well, it is, and I was very lucky in that, obviously, because I was in the punk scene in the UK, and people thought I might get them, press in the UK. People were nice to me, and obviously, well, the Screamers weren't, but that was okay. I was privileged. I got to go into Mabuhay free and all that stuff, and meet all the people. Meet a lot of the bands. I met the residents during that period, or a couple of people from the residents who I really liked. Hardy I met, and Jay, and I met the Avengers, Dils. So I saw. I remember being dragged around to see the Mutants, and I just didn't understand that at all. I must have been in a bad mood that day. And there's also, I'm in Ruby Ray's book somewhere, and I'm in the Mutants lot, and I look so fed up. And we went to see the Screamers recording 122 Hours of Fear and Vertigo at Target Video.
Oh, okay.
And that was fantastic. That was a real high spot, because I thought, the 122 Hours of Fear clip is on YouTube, and it's absolutely fucking fantastic. And I was going to work on a documentary about Tomato, which never happened. I've got one of Tomato's pictures in my house. In fact, I can show you. Hang on. Yeah.
Wow.
So I was a big fan of the Screamers, and of course, and this was an issue. Of course, we didn't talk about it then. They were gay, two of them were gay, and so was I, and we didn't talk about it at all. That's the weirdest thing actually for me now, is three gay men in a room not saying one word about being what it was like to be gay. Not one word. That's how things have changed.
Did you sense that things were, obviously San Francisco, but did you sense that there was any more openness in San Francisco compared to LA or England? Or was it, well, I know that you interviewed the Screamers, probably would have been in LA.
It was pretty bloody awful, to be honest. I resent this greatly in retrospect, how awful it was. It really wasn't good. If you didn't want to be on the gay scene liking disco, which I didn't at the time, which was probably my fault, because I really like disco. But at the time, apart from I Feel Love and a couple of Sylvester cuts, and I would never have gone to a gay club at that point. So if you didn't want that, there wasn't much to grab hold of, really. There was this gay identity, this gay scene, which didn't attract me for whatever reasons, maybe my own internalized homophobia. But I remember it all as being pretty bloody grim, to be honest, which makes me very angry in retrospect. And I just think, well, we were all in a liberal atmosphere. Why didn't the Screamers and I fucking talk about it? They didn't want to talk about it. I would have talked about it, but it didn't seem to come up. Yeah. But I suppose the Screamers felt constrained, as in fact anybody would have done in England, by the then current prescription against being gay. It wasn't great to be seen as gay. And then if you did come out as gay, like somebody like Tom Robinson, who was very brave to do so, you got tagged as a gay artist, which of course no pop artist really wants, because that automatically seems to limit your audience. And also the American music industry is very different from the English music industry. In many ways, the English music industry is more like the American art industry, in that was more tolerant of difference and kind of weird behavior and artistic exploration, whereas I always found the American music industry, particularly the rock music industry, quasi-fascist, to be honest.
So, yeah, because, certainly
it was hateful.
Yeah, in the context of the rest of America, San Francisco feels a little bit like another country. And then, but even the band that had the most connection to the gay underground culture would have been Tuxedo Moon. Well, them and Indoor Life, and they both moved away. Kind of interesting,
I saw Tuxedo Moon I must have met them through Vale. I saw them. I saw Tuxedo Moon at the MAB, and I met them through Vale. And again, of course, we didn't talk about it.
Yeah.
Ridiculous, really. And that's why I'm so sort of cross with all the macho boys, you know. And it's like, fuck off, fuck you. Punk was supposed to be about being different. It wasn't supposed to be about being a jock. I haven't been at the cutting edge of pop culture for a long, long time, and that's okay by me. The period we're talking about, I was.
Right.
And that was great, and that was very exciting, you know. And I managed to stay there for a while, but, you know, you can't when you get older. It's too time-consuming. And anyway, it's not your culture. It's a younger person's culture, really, particularly in rock music, which is all about... a generational identification. Rock music is all about generational identification, which is why you have the successive waves of rock nostalgia, which we do.
Yeah.
Certainly in the UK, you know, the minute the Smiths have been big, who knows who's going to be big next? Oh, Joy Division have been big, but, you know, so it's because people identify with those groups when they're young, and it's a kind of form of identity generator, which you don't get so much necessarily in the same way in dance music or Black American music. It's different. You know, the time I was on the West Coast was very exciting for me, and I mean, very few people from the UK made that trip, and I'm very glad that I did. And I did write about some of it when I got back, but nobody was interested. Absolutely nobody. I got a Screamless piece into the Melody Maker, which was sort of amazing. And I'd write about the records, but nobody was interested, you know, because, you know, punk began in England, as if. And that's something I always hated as well, because it always seemed to me that punk was an idea that was in the air, and it was in the air in different places in 75. So it was in New York, it was in Cleveland, first stirrings maybe on the West Coast, Paris, places like that. It wasn't an English thing. And I always resented the fact that people in the UK say, well, you know, it's our thing. It wasn't, you know, it just wasn't. You know, I like the fact that music wasn't nationalistic; it was international.
Yeah. So how did you? I mean, if even other writers weren't interested in bands like the ones that you saw on the West Coast, how did you find out about them? Was it just a matter of being extra curious and diligent? I mean, and.
Well, no. Well, I mean, I was diligent, and part of that diligence, I was right on the Music Trust for 3 years, between April 77 and April 80. Okay. 3 years. So I was on the weekly Music Trust. It was my job. I saw my job as finding interesting new music. That was my patch. You know, that's what I was there for. I wasn't interested in, particularly in furthering my own ego or going back into the past. There was so much happening that I thought was worthwhile. And as part of that, I'd written a lot about fanzines, and as part of that, I'd got hold of Search and Destroy and Slash, and I started a dialogue with both Claude, Bessie, and Vale.
Okay.
And I would do stuff for them, or send them pictures, or write things from them. I'd send Vale interview tapes. I mean, several of the early Search and Destroys. Interviewed Buzzcocks, interviewed Cabaret Voltaire, interviewed Throbbing Gristle, interviewed J.G. Ballard. So I mean, all, you know, in sort of 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, those issues. And in return, Vale would send me the records. Oh. So the records hardly got to the UK. So he would send me stacks of Danger House, you know, whatever, the Sleepers EP, you know, all that stuff that's worth a mint now. And I would hear them, and I really liked them. I played them. I was obsessed with the Sleepers EP. I thought it was fantastic, in particular. And I was obsessed with I loved I love most of it, but another one I loved was the Middle Class EP, Out of Vogue. That was fantastic. And I liked, you know, all the Danger House stuff, Car Crash. We've got the Neutron Bomb, all that stuff. I mean, it's really good. It's really good stuff. And I put it on that comp that I did for Domino, Black Hole, which I was very pleased about. So that was my payment. You know, I'd get a single by the Zeros and the Post. Great. What is it? Oh, it's Wild Weekend. Fucking great. So that's the way it worked. And so when I went out to LA, I was all primed, really. LA and then San Francisco, I was all primed. Because I thought the stuff was great, and I was looking forward to seeing them play live, and meeting them. And I mean, the Screamers were funny because I went to the Wilton Hilton in Hollywood, and they were being horrible to me. And I didn't take it personally, actually. I was just horrible back, and we ended up by getting on very well. That's just how people were then. Everybody was horrible to each other. It's weird when I think about it now. Anyway, that's just the way it was.
So the records, like if somebody, like, would you even come across the records in a shop anywhere in England, or?
Rough Trade might have had 2 or 3. That would have probably been the only place.
Okay.
And even then, it would have been intermittent. I don't remember anybody in this country having a Sleepers EP.
Okay.
I mean, Rough Trade might have set something up with Danger House. I don't know. But it was very marginal. Nobody was writing about this stuff in the UK, except me, actually. I did a singles review of some of these records in November 77. I wrote about the Dils and the Avengers and those first Danger House records, and Perubu at the same time.
Okay, yeah, that is really early. That's within a few months of the Avengers being a band. And okay, yeah, because it's interesting because within about 3 years, and you might already find this era, or this might be what you would find to be an uninteresting era, but circa like 1984, 85 in San Francisco, it really wasn't that much happening compared to 5 years before, especially. But there was a little group of bands that were actually very influenced by Joy Division and Killing Joke and stuff, and it's like the Sleepers, even though they were from the same city, weren't even on the radar of, say, people who moved to San Francisco in '82, like younger musicians. And
yes,
Joy Division, so even though they were in the same city, their inspiration was not, and I don't even know if they were even really that aware of them, other than seeing Ricky Williams wandering around and somebody saying that guy was in the Sleepers or something. But did you meet him?
I don't remember. I do remember meeting Michael, but I don't remember meeting Ricky, no. I was only in San Francisco for about a week, I think.
Okay.
Have you got that new Ruby Ray book?
Yes. Yeah, there is a photo in there.
Yeah. Cool. I mean, I thought she took great photos. I thought she took fantastic photos. So I am in there, and there's one picture of me with Vale and a few other people. I have no memory of that shot at all. It's very funny. We're all doing punk poses, and I have no memory of that at all. So it was an eye-opener to me to come to San Francisco, really, because it's bloody West Coast. And I sent you that picture of me on top of Coit, near Coit Tower.
Right.
And it was just mind-blowing to me, actually, to be honest, being in San Francisco, and in LA, just being in America. It was a real mind blower, and actually, really, that trip really changed my life, because it just seemed to open everything up for me. And fairly soon after that, I got a few months after that, I got myself a very big record. I remember playing in a lot in Vale's flat. Was the second Talking Heads record. More Songs About Buildings and Food, which is a great record. And I remember there was this song on it called Found a Job, and it was all about getting a job that you like. At the time I was in the UK, I was doing a job I hated, and I thought, well, actually, that's pretty good advice. And something like 6 months after that, I got a job in television, which was my dream job then at the time, although that was another story, really. But it was a crucial trip for me, that actually going out to the West Coast and experiencing that space. That's what people on the West Coast don't understand about the UK, really, that it's very claustrophobic. And you just get out to California, and it's like, fuck, there's loads of space. And I know that, Los Angeles can be very claustrophobic as well, and so can San Francisco. But, compared to the UK, it's so different, so different.
Did you notice anything? So this will sound absurd to you, but I felt like I see a little similarity, and some other people have pointed out, in that San Francisco has more of a climate that is kind of similar to parts of England, and that it was also, at least at that time, a port city and had some, at least industrial kind of areas that there's some kind of affinity with a place like Manchester, or I don't know.
Well, I always saw Manchester as being like Cleveland.
Okay.
In that it was a very obviously degraded industrial city, which I didn't think that San Francisco was. San Francisco felt quite assimilable to me as a European, really, in the way that LA didn't. LA's fucking weird. LA's a complete mindfuck. Whereas San Francisco, well, it was damp. It was on a different scale to LA. It's on all those hills. It's on a more European scale in a way. So it felt easier than LA. But of course, LA to me was slightly more interesting because it was so odd and scary. To be honest, I find Los Angeles quite frightening because of the elision between reality and fantasy, which is just endemic there, really.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting because there was somebody who did a zine in the mid '80s, 84, 85. This wouldn't have been 1/10 as well known as Search and Destroy, but he was very inspired by Joy Division and Factory Records, and so he almost like portrays San Francisco as this, and these bands as coming from this industrial kind of place. And there were parts of the city that are like that, but it's not the part where the Mabuhay is. Anyway, that's the
I mean, it wasn't North Beach, was it?
No. Yeah, North Beach is
it's kind of Hunter's Point, places like that.
Right. Okay. Exactly. Yeah. And so that's where a lot of these bands were rehearsing in the mid '80s, and so they were kind of around those spaces.
So what would they call the bands that were influenced by Joy Division? Those 84, 85 groups.
I don't even know. I've struggled with that. I default to calling it the Wiring Department scene because the zine was called Wiring Department, and that's what the guy was in a band called Glorious Den. This guy Eric Cope, who was actually from Sri Lanka, but he wound up in and singing like very baritone, very flat, and the early version of Faith No More was part of that. They were very influenced by Killing Joke and somewhat Joy Division before they had Mike Patton and all that stuff. And there was another band called Trial that came out of like teenagers playing hardcore but not wanting to do hardcore and being a little more artsy. So some of that stuff is very severe and stern and Rainy Day. But it's interesting because, it seems like collectively they were drawing on some connection between their own kind of microclimate there in Hunters Point or where they were rehearsing, and then these influences coming from England. And then I was trying to speculate as to, whether there was some natural affinity there or whether it's just that so much music was coming from England that that people were going to latch onto.
I think that's stretching it, to be honest. Yeah. I always thought that the real influence was really Pere Ubu on Joy Division, because Joy Division, I went to, Pere Ubu did their first UK show in Manchester.
Oh, okay.
And I went to that place called Rafters, and that was May 78. I was a huge Pere Ubu fan. And that high kind of bass sound that they had.
Right.
Where the bass carried the melody and was played high. Well, Peter Hook was in the audience. So, I think he got it from that. I think he got it from Pere Ubu. So I always saw Manchester in terms much more of Cleveland, really, than San Francisco. I never got that really link between. San Francisco is too cute, whereas Manchester is just not cute, and nor is Cleveland, There are cute bits of San Francisco which they just aren't in either Manchester or Cleveland. I've been to Cleveland, many times. I've been to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame 6 or 7 times. I did some work there. I was shown around by Jim Jones, who was one of Pere Ubu for a while. And he took me down into the flats and all that, and it was just insane. I'd never seen anything like it.
Well, this is a good counterpoint. Yeah, I've never been to Cleveland. I've been to Manchester. It was like 2012. So.
Well, it's very different now. It's been comprehensively regenerated. You know, it was a real shithole back in the day.
Okay. Yeah, I saw
really empty and really, really derelict. Yeah.
Okay, because I saw that even the hacienda is an apartment complex or condominiums or something.
Well, the hacienda was the start of the regeneration of Manchester, basically, which was 81. You know, and that suddenly accelerated in the last 20 years. It's unrecognisable from the city I lived in the late 70s.
This might be a little bit of a stretch to tie this back to the Harry Crosby thing, but thinking about, you know, you mentioned the bad influences or something, just the story, the arc of his life and the failure that, or obviously the ending that he came to, seems like, you know, I don't know if it's just more of an archetype that some of these people latched onto, but people like Will Shatter and some of these people who were hanging around, you know, when Will Shatter died, it was 1987 of an overdose, not a murder-suicide. And I don't even know if he read that book, but he probably did. But there was almost there's an extreme element of self-sabotage with some of these musicians. And you could say Michael fits in that category, but Jon
Vinyl died, didn't he?
Right, yeah, in 1983, and then there were even a few others. I don't know if you'd find the same number of early people dying young, but a lot of really intelligent kind of, you could say tortured artists, but just, I don't know. I'm thinking what you said earlier about how it seemed hopeless for them in one sense in terms of.
I think the whole punk thing was, as Vale talks about in England's Dreaming, the whole punk thing was an exploration into the dark side.
Yeah.
And to the dark side of human nature. And, you know, the whole idea of punk was being, you know, the word is somebody who's hopeless, really. Comes from the etymology of the word. And this is why I always found the machismo so ridiculous, because of course one part of that etymology of punk is, you know, the young guy that takes the wang up the bung in prison. How can you be macho when you've got to wang up your bum? It doesn't compute. So I always find punks being macho completely ridiculous, to be honest. But it's also, you know, you're going to be a bit of badass. You were the kid that wrote swastikas on your school books, you know?
Mm-hmm.
You're going to play with the dark side. And of course then, as I'm sure it is now, but there was a particular dark side aesthetic. And drugs were a part of that. I was very fortunate personally in that I never really I never took heroin ever. I didn't like cocaine. And I didn't like speed very much. It just didn't suit me. So I was very fortunate. I didn't find them interesting. And I was too scared of heroin to go there. So I never got hung up on hard drugs. But a lot of people in the UK did. There was a massive drug scene, particularly in the UK, because a lot of the Shah of Iran, after the Shah of Iran was deposed, a lot of people came from Iran with heroin as hard contraband. And so there was an explosion of heroin in the UK in 79, 80. And of course, punks were already taking speed. So, you know, if you're going to take powders, there's not that huge a difference between taking speed and taking heroin. So there is that badass aspect to it. And I think there's an element to the hopelessness and the romance of that happens on the West Coast, really. I'm not sure how direct an influence Harry Crosby would have been, because he's more decadent than hopeless.
Yeah.
But it is that idea, it's a sort of metaphor, isn't it, really? I don't think there's a direct influence unless people read it and it sort of fed that side of themselves. And you don't know where the self-destruction comes from, you know. I mean, Don Vinyl was gay, you know. Who knows what happens to people? And, you know, these deaths are, like Ricky Williams' death, they're not very well recorded. People don't really talk about their psychology. You're talking about an age before people really talk about psychology, feelings. It's a very, very, very different time. And there wasn't the openness now that there is now about what people go through and, the struggles that they have.
Right. Yeah. And I'm trying to, because of there's a fair number of these personalities that I'll relate to to some extent, but not the artistic achievements that they've made or the extreme reckless decisions. But it's a tricky kind of balance to document what happened without romanticizing or glorifying the destructive.
Well, I always thought taking heroin was stupid. Why would you take heroin? Because if it would probably make you ill. And secondly, if you liked it, you'd have a problem. So it never made sense to me, ever.
Right.
I mean, people around me did heroin. I was offered heroin. I just said, no, I don't want to do it. I'm just not interested. So I never was that influenced by that kind of peer pressure that, you're a wimp if you don't take it and all that kind of stuff. I was never part of that. I thought, you can call me a wimp, you can call me what you like. I'm still not taking the fucking stuff. I don't know whether it's peer pressure or whether it's inspiration or whether it's just, it's around. It's probably as banal as that, to be honest.
Yeah, and so I wanted to connect the same line of thinking, and this will be I can make this my last question because I said it would be less than an hour, but there's a part from England's Dreaming where you it's at the end of chapter 10 where you ask a series of sort of, I guess they're rhetorical questions, but how could you be tough and a loser at the same time? How could you take a script from Rimbaud and avoid the mythical trajectory of that poet's life? Built into punk from the beginning was not only a tendency to self-destruction, but a short shelf life. And then to succeed in conventional terms meant that you had failed on your own terms, and vice versa. And it seems like a lot of the kind of history that plays out after.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
That is really good. If you don't mind, I'm going to quote that. But I mean, that's the kind of the I think a lot of that paradox and the way that it plays out is kind of central to a lot. I know that you were obviously writing about punk in general and more England in particular, but it seems to really apply to a lot of.
I mean, in a way, those were accurate and indeed prophetic words, because of course the person that embodied that most was Kurt Cobain.
Right. Yeah.
Who I interviewed in 1993. That was the last big rock interview I ever did with a contemporary performer, and that was a large part of Kurt Cobain's problem.
Right. Yeah.
Plus the heroin.
Right. But
I just couldn't believe. I mean, honestly, I just couldn't believe that people were taking heroin. I just couldn't fucking believe it. I just couldn't believe it. I mean, I was old enough in the hippie era to believe all that stuff that they said in the hippie magazines. Speed kills and don't take the dreaded smack, children. I liked weed and I liked LSD. It was very different from, the powders.
Yeah.
That was speed. I like the hallucinogens. I like the psychedelics.
Yeah, and it's just the different. It's kind of for a lot of the people who I'm looking at, whether it's, I mean, Flipper really embodies this as far as San Francisco, because it's this brief period when they were kind of on top of the world or on top of the scene, and then it's this long, drawn-out kind of train wreck with multiple people dying and horrible arguments between the band members and comebacks that were really not very well received. And you could say that, well, they really failed miserably. They really failed wonderfully. But I don't really know where I'm going with this, but it's almost kind of there is that kind of internal kind of tension between different ideas of failing and succeeding, and I guess
the problem is with punk. The problem with punk is that it was very negative, and the negativity was very important and very useful to cut through that dreadful kind of post-hippie, post-glitter miasma You needed something fairly strong to cut through all that crap, because it was crap by 75, 76. It was awful. And the negativity was a reflection, a kind of prediction of what was going to happen in politics with the right-wing regimes in the UK and the US in the 80s. So it was an artistic movement, punk, but it was very negative. And at some point, you have to be able to turn around and say, well, I don't believe in that. That's a load of fucking shit. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da. What do I believe in?
Right.
What am I going to say yes to? And for all the fact that punks derided hippies, which I thought was really boring, because a lot of punks had been hippies, the hippies did come up with some stuff, ecology in particular, and alternative lifestyles, alternative ways of eating. You didn't have to eat meat all the time. They actually came up with quite a lot of constructive things, and also were futuristic in terms of where the mind could take you and where spiritual practice could take you. And all the people that I know now who were involved with punk but have good lives have turned around at some point and have been able to say, yes, this, I believe in this. I'm going to undertake this practice. I'm going to be disciplined. I'm not going to be a bitter old fart. And so many of them are. Look at them all. They're awful. They've all turned into horrible old men because they never turned around and said yes to anything and then lived by that.
Right. Yeah, that is the challenge.
So,
yeah.
That is the challenge. And it was a challenge for all the people in the... I read Alice Bagg's book, and I thought it was very interesting, actually, because she was trying to come to terms with all that. It was a good book. You have to turn around and say, yes, what's the point of living otherwise? And I think that was probably even harder for the groups on the West Coast, maybe.
Let's begin, listen not again. Talk about the nightmares of Virgin City, our bottom raw. Slippery towers, visions of ours. Hot to think you're dying for.